Seraphina, I beg you, let me in.
Why should I? You bring only trouble.
Please, I'll die out here.
Then you should have stayed away.
The snow had been falling for 3 hours, and Seraphine Voss had been watching the man collapse against her gate for 2 of them. He was on his knees now, coat torn, fingers blue, breath coming out in ragged clouds, begging. "Please," he rasped, lifting his eyes to hers. "Just let me in. I won't survive the night out here." She almost did it. She almost opened the gate. But something about the way he said please, too smooth, too practiced, like a man who had never truly begged for anything in his life, made her hand freeze on the latch. Who begs like that? Who kneels in the snow and still manages to look like he owns the ground beneath him? She didn't know his name. She didn't know his face. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the half-frozen stranger shivering at her gate was Caelum Ashford, the most feared duke in all of England, and he had not stumbled to her door by accident. What is he really after? And what happens when she finally lets him in? If you need to find out, subscribe, because this story is just getting started. All Part 1. Seraphine didn't open the gate, not yet. She stood there in the cold, her wool shawl pulled tight across her chest, watching him through the iron bars like he was something the storm had dragged in and left on her doorstep. The candle she was holding flickered. The wind nearly took it twice. He was still on his knees. Most men would have stood up by now. Pride would have made them. But this one just stayed there, head slightly bowed, those blue-tinted fingers gripping the gate like it was the only solid thing left in the world. His breathing was shallow. His lips had gone the color of ash. And still, even like that, even broken and half-buried in snow, there was something about him that didn't sit right with her. Something that felt less like helplessness and more like strategy. Seraphine Voss had grown up learning the difference. She was 24 years old and had been running her late father's estate alone for 3 of those years. Not with help. Not with a man at the head of the table pretending the decisions were his. Alone. She had negotiated with merchants who thought a woman's signature meant nothing. She had sat across from lawyers who spoke to the wall behind her head. She had watched neighbors actually wait, for her to fail so they could swoop in with their sympathies and their offers to take the land off her hands. She hadn't failed. She didn't intend to start tonight. But the man at her gate was turning a very specific shade of blue, and Seraphine was not, despite everything, heartless. She lifted the latch. The gate swung inward with a groan of cold metal, and he almost fell through it. She caught his arm without thinking, grabbed a fistful of his coat and pulled, and the weight of him nearly took her down into the snow with him. He was tall, broader than she'd realized. Up close, the expensive cut of his coat was impossible to miss, even soaked through and ruined as it was. The buttons were gold, real gold. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, quietly, carefully, filing it away. "Can you walk?" she asked. He turned his head and looked at her. That was the first time she saw his eyes. They were dark. Not brown. Not quite. Something closer to black in the low light, sharp and still and completely, unsettlingly alert for a man who'd been kneeling in a blizzard for the better part of an hour. There was no glaze of cold confusion in them. No fog of exhaustion. Just clarity. A watching, measuring kind of clarity that made the back of her neck prickle. "Yes," he said. One word. Low voice, steady. She should have closed the gate right then. She didn't. She got his arm across her shoulders instead, and they moved toward the house in slow, uneven steps, his boots dragging twin furrows through the snow. He was heavier than any man had a right to be. She could feel the cold radiating off him, soaking through her shawl and into her skin, and yet beneath it, beneath all that ice, there was a solidity to him, a kind of coiled stillness, that made her feel less like she was helping an injured man and more like she was walking beside something that was only pretending to need help. She shoved the thought down. They reached the door. Her housekeeper, Mabel, was already in the hallway when Seraphine pushed it open, her face doing everything a face can do in the space of 2 seconds. Shock, alarm, disapproval, and then the tight-mouthed resignation of a woman who had worked for the Voss family long enough to know that Seraphine was going to do what Seraphine was going to do. "Get blankets," Seraphine said, "and heat the water." Mabel looked at the man, then back at Seraphine. "And who is? I don't know yet." She helped him to the chair nearest the fire, the one her father used to sit in, and lowered him into it. His jaw was tight. She could see the effort it was taking him to hold himself together, the controlled breathing, the rigid set of his shoulders, and again that wrongness moved through her like a cold current. Injured men didn't hold themselves like that. Soldiers did. She crouched in front of him, bringing herself to eye level, and looked at him directly the way she always did when she wanted to make clear that she was not going to be managed. "Your name," she said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly, there and gone quick as a blink, and she filed that away too. Caelum, he said. Just the one name. Caelum what? A pause. Brief. The fire crackled between them and the snow tapped against the window like it was trying to get in. Too, and he looked at her with those dark measuring eyes and said very calmly, Ashford. The name meant nothing to her. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went to help Mabel with the blankets. It wouldn't mean nothing for long, because 3 miles away, on the frozen road that cut through Hadley Wood, a man with a lantern and a pistol was turning in slow circles, looking for the body he was certain he had left behind. And in the chair by Seraphine's fire, Caelum Ashford, the Duke of Wrenmore, the man half of England feared, and the other half pretended not to know, sat very still, very quiet, and let the warmth begin to return to his hands. He had not stumbled to her door by accident. He had known exactly whose gate this was. What he had not counted on, what no one had warned him about, in all the years of briefings and strategy and careful, bloodless planning, was the way she'd looked at him through those iron bars. Not with fear, not with pity, with that flat, unimpressed, I see you clarity that very few people had ever aimed in his direction. Most people, when they looked at Caelum Ashford, saw what he wanted them to see. She had looked at him like she wasn't sure what she was seeing yet, and intended to find out. That was a problem. That was in fact a very specific kind of problem he had not prepared for. Outside the snow kept falling. The man in Hadley Wood kept searching, and inside the small fire-lit house at the edge of the Voss estate, 2 people sat in the same room for the first time, one of them hiding everything, and one of them already starting to notice. Who sent that man with the pistol? What did Caelum really come here to do? And how long before Seraphine starts asking the questions he can't afford to answer? If you want to find out what happens next, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss part 2. This story is only getting deeper. Part 2. Seraphine had not slept well in 3 years. This was not something she told people. It was not something she mentioned over tea or let slip in conversation. It was simply a fact of her life. The way the leaking roof in the East Wing was a fact, and the unpaid tax assessment from last spring was a fact, and the way her father's chair still held the shape of him, even though he'd been gone 37 months now. Some things you didn't talk about. You just lived around them. She was sitting at the kitchen table when the clock struck 2 in the morning, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, listening to the house breathe. Old houses breathed. She had learned that young. The wood settled and the pipes knocked, and the wind found all the places the walls weren't quite sealed. And if you listened long enough, it started to sound almost like company. Almost. She had gotten very good at almost. Her father, Dorian Voss, had been a quiet man with loud debts. That was how she thought of him now, with the particular clarity that grief eventually allows. Not cruel, not unkind, just honest. He had loved her in his distracted, half-present way, the way a man loves something he assumes will always be there. He had also borrowed against the estate 4 times without telling her, signed agreements she didn't know existed, and then had the indecency to die of a fever on a Tuesday in October before she could sit him down and ask him what exactly he had been thinking. She had found out the rest from lawyers. 3 years of finding out from lawyers. The estate was survivable. That was the word she used. Not thriving, not secure, survivable. She had cut costs where she could, dismissed staff she couldn't afford to keep, taken on work that a woman of her station was not supposed to take on, and done it quietly enough that the neighbors could pretend not to notice. She had kept the house. She had kept the land. She had not sold a single acre, not to Aldrich Fenmore next door, who had been angling for the East Field for 2 years, not to anyone. Survivable. It didn't leave a lot of room for unexpected guests. She looked toward the hallway. Mabel had put him in the small room off the parlor. Not a guest room exactly. More of a room that had never quite decided what it was. And the last time Seraphine had checked, an hour ago, he had been asleep, or appeared to be asleep. She was no longer entirely certain those were the same thing where he was concerned. She thought about his eyes again and told herself to stop. The problem with Caelum Ashford, one of the problems, the list was already growing, was that he didn't behave like a man who had nearly frozen to death. People who nearly froze to death were confused, grateful, emotional in the loose and unguarded way that fear produced. They asked where they were. They thanked you too many times. They slept the heavy, collapsed sleep of a body that had been through something. He had drunk the broth Mabel brought him without comment. He had answered her questions with the minimum number of words required. And when she'd checked on him at 1 in the morning, he had been lying completely still, eyes closed, hands folded over the blanket like a man waiting, not sleeping. She had stood in the doorway for a long moment. He hadn't moved, but she had the distinct, unshakable feeling that he had known she was there. She pushed back from the kitchen table now and carried her cold tea to the window. Outside, the snow had finally stopped. The world was white and silent and deeply, completely still. And somewhere out there, 3 miles east if she had to guess, was whatever he had come from, whatever he was running from. Because men didn't end up at iron gates in blizzards without a reason, and the reasons were never simple. Her mother had taught her that. Rosalind Voss had been gone since Seraphine was 11, not dead, gone, which was its own specific kind of wound. She had walked out on a cold morning very much like this one, with a traveling bag and an expression Seraphine had not understood at the time, but understood perfectly now. The expression of a woman who had calculated her options and chosen the only one that felt survivable. She had not taken Seraphine with her. For a long time, Seraphine had been angry about that. Now she mostly just understood it in a way that felt worse than anger. What it had taught her, practically speaking, was this. You could not afford to trust the version of a person they presented to you in a moment of need. People in need showed you what they wanted you to see, what they needed you to see. Her mother had been soft and sweet as helpless right up until she wasn't. Her father had been steady and reliable right up until the lawyers arrived. And the man in the room off the parlor was helpless and half frozen right up until you looked at his eyes. And then he wasn't that either. She heard the floorboard creak, not the house-breathing kind of creak, the weight of a person kind. She turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway. He had found his way into a dry shirt. Mabel must have left one of the old ones from the storage trunk. And his feet were bare on the stone floor, and his dark hair was loose, and he looked, objectively, nothing like a threat. He looked like a man who couldn't sleep. He looked almost ordinary. Almost. You should be resting, she said. I don't sleep well, he said. Something about that landed differently than it should have. She looked at him for a moment and then turned back to the window because it was easier than examining why. Neither do I, she said, before she'd decided to say it. She heard him cross the kitchen. He stopped a few feet away, not close, not crowding her, and stood beside her at the window the way you stand beside someone you've known long enough to be quiet with, which made no sense. She had known him for approximately 3 hours. Your estate, he said after a moment. Yes, you run it alone. It wasn't a question. She glanced at him. What makes you say that? The way you move through it, he said simply. Like every room is your responsibility. She didn't answer that. Not because she couldn't, but because something about being seen that clearly, that quickly, by someone she didn't know, required a moment to absorb. You're from money, she said instead, nodding toward the hallway where his ruined coat was hanging. Real money. Old money. So whatever landed you in the snow outside my gate tonight wasn't an accident and wasn't poverty. She looked at him directly, which means someone put you there. He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. You're observant, he said. I'm practical, she said. There's a difference. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise, something in between, something that came and went too fast. And there it was again, that feeling, that current of wrongness and rightness mixed together in a way she couldn't parse. He was dangerous. She didn't know how she knew that, not in the obvious way, not in the way of a man with a raised fist, but in the way of someone who understood, power the way most people understood weather, as simply a condition of the world. And yet standing here, bare feet on her cold kitchen floor, he seemed almost, not harmless, never harmless, but present. Actually present in a way that most people she met weren't. Her neighbors were present in the way of people performing presence. He was just there in the room, occupying it completely without seeming to try. She hated that she noticed that. You should sleep, she said again, her voice coming out steadier than she felt. Whatever you're running from will still be there in the morning, and you'll handle it better rested. He looked at her. What makes you think I'm running? Because people who are chasing something, she said, don't kneel. She left him standing at the window with that and walked back to her room, and she did not look back. And she was almost, there was that word again, almost convinced that the tight, strange feeling in her chest was just exhaustion. Almost. She lay down on top of her covers without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought about his eyes and his bare feet and the way he'd said you. Re-observant like it was something he didn't encounter often, and she thought about the man with the lantern who was probably still out there, somewhere, still searching, and she thought about the way Caelum Ashford had stood in her kitchen like he belonged there and hadn't apologized for it. Once, she thought about all of it. Sleep didn't come for a very long time, and when it finally did, she dreamed of iron gates and snow and a man on his knees who was never really on his knees at all. What is Caelum really hiding? Who sent that man into the woods after him? And how long can Seraphine keep telling herself she isn't curious? Part 3. Seraphine woke to the sound of voices, not loud voices, not arguing, Just the low, careful kind of conversation that people have when they don't want to be overheard, which was somehow worse. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, moving down the hallway in her stockings, with her shawl half pulled around her shoulders, following the sound toward the front of the house. She stopped just outside the parlor door, Mabel's voice and his. "She won't like it," Mabel was saying. "I'm not asking her to like it." His voice was calm, the kind of calm that came from practice. "I'm asking you to tell me who has been coming to the property. In the last month. Anyone unfamiliar." A pause. She could picture Mabel's face doing that thing it did, the tight-mouthed weighing of loyalties. "There was a man," Mabel said finally. 2 weeks ago. Said he was from the county assessor's office. Miss Voss wasn't home. I told him to come back." "Did he?" "No." "What did he look like?" Seraphine pushed the door open. Both of them turned. Mabel had the grace to look caught. Caelum did not. He was sitting forward in the chair by the cold fireplace, elbows on his knees, and he looked at her with those dark eyes and waited, completely unrattled, like a man who had been expecting the interruption and had simply been making use of the time before it arrived. "Mabel," Seraphine said very quietly, "would you give us a moment?" It wasn't a question. Mabel gave Caelum one last unreadable look and left. Seraphine closed the door and stood with her back against it and looked at him. "You've been awake for a while," she said. "Yes. And in that time you decided to question my housekeeper about my visitors." "Yes." She waited for an explanation. He didn't offer one, and the absence of it was its own kind of answer. Most people, when caught doing something they shouldn't, filled the silence. They explained, justified, apologized, talked themselves in circles. He just sat there and let the silence exist and watched her move through it, and that patience, that absolute unhurried patience, was more unsettling than any excuse could have been. "Why?" she said. "Because someone has been watching this property," he said, "and I needed to know how long." The floor felt slightly less solid than it had a moment ago. She didn't let it show. "Watching it for what reason?" "For me," he said, "or for you. I'm not yet certain which." She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from him because she refused to have this conversation standing in her own parlor like a guest in her own house. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked at him and thought, carefully, about what she already knew and what she didn't, and decided the fastest route was the direct one. "Who are you?" she said. "Not your name." "I have your name. Who are you?" Something shifted in his face. Not much. A small tightening around the eyes, a kind of internal decision being made, and then he said it the way a man sets something heavy down on a table. "I am the Duke of Wrenmore." The room was very quiet. She had heard of Wrenmore. Everyone had heard of Wrenmore, the way you'd heard of a storm that had leveled a town 3 counties over. You didn't need to have been there to know it was real. The Duke of Wrenmore was, she searched her memory, pulling up fragments of overheard conversations, things said quickly in drawing rooms, and then changed when the speaker noticed they were being listened to, powerful, connected to the crown in ways that were never quite specified, involved in things that were never quite named, feared. That was the word people used when they thought no one was paying attention. She had let a feared duke in through her gate in the middle of a blizzard, and put him in her spare room, and made him broth, and stood with him at her kitchen window at 2 in the morning while he looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't anticipated, and she had not known. She had not known any of it. The anger came quietly, which was how her anger always came. Not hot and immediate, but slow and rising, like water through a cracked floor. "You told me your name," she said. "I did. You didn't tell me what you were." "No," he said, "I didn't." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Still controlled, still careful, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Something that might, in a different man, have been called honesty. "Because the last time I told someone who I was," he said, "within 48 hours, there were 3 men outside my door who had been paid to make sure I didn't leave through it." He paused. "I needed to know I was safe before I told you. I needed to know what kind of person you were, and now you know." "I know enough," he said. She held his gaze and felt that current move through her again, stronger this time, and she recognized it now for what it was. Not fear, not attraction, or not only that. It was the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something and knowing that the next step would change the shape of everything. She had felt it the day the lawyers came. She had felt it the morning she signed her name to the first loan repayment, and realized she was genuinely, completely alone in it, the feeling of the world rearranging itself around a single moment. "The man who was looking for you last night," she said. "In the woods, yes, he'll come back, probably not alone." She stood up and went to the window. The snow was still and white and innocent looking in the morning light, and the gate was closed, and the road beyond it was empty, and none of that meant anything. She understood that now. What do you need, she said. She heard him shift in the chair. I need 2 days. 3 at the most. I have people I can reach, but it takes time to do it safely. If I move too soon, I'm visible. If I'm visible, he stopped. You're dead, she said flatly. Yes, she turned around. And what does that mean for me? For this house? If someone comes looking for you here, if they find you here, what does that make me? He didn't look away. It makes you a problem they'll want to resolve. The bluntness of it hit her like cold water, and she was almost grateful for it. She had spent 3 years being managed by men who softened their words and slid around the truth sideways, and there was something almost clarifying about a man who would just say the thing. It made him easier to be angry at, and easier to trust in the same breath, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that. You should have told me last night, she said. Last night I wasn't sure I'd survive to morning. You seemed fairly sure of yourself for a man at death's door. Something moved through his expression. Not quite a smile. I've been told I hide it well. You hide everything well. The words came out before she'd weighed them, and she watched them land. Watched that small shift in his face, that flicker of something unguarded and quickly contained, and she made herself continue before the moment could expand into something she wasn't ready for. If you're staying, I need to know everything. Not the version you've decided is safe to tell me. Everything. He was quiet. The fire was dead in the grate, and the morning light was coming in, cold and flat through the window, and outside somewhere a bird was making its first uncertain noise of the day, and Caelum Ashford, Duke of Wrenmore, the man half of England feared, was sitting in her dead father's chair looking at her like she was the most unexpected thing he had encountered in a very long time. Everything, he repeated. Every single thing, she said. He nodded once, slow, and then he said, close the curtains first. She did. And what he told her in that cold, curtain-drawn parlor with the dead fire and the morning trying to get in through the edges of the windows. What he told her changed the shape of the room, and then the shape of the house, and then the shape of everything she thought she understood about why she had been struggling to hold this estate together for 3 years, and why the county assessor's man had come and not come back, and why her father had borrowed, and never quite said from whom. She sat very still while he talked, and when he was done she said nothing for a long time. Outside, at the far end of the road, a horse and rider had stopped at the tree line. The rider didn't move, just sat there in the pale morning looking toward the house, waiting. Caelum saw him before she did. She knew because she saw his hand move, just slightly, just enough, and the quality of his stillness changed from calm into something altogether different, something coiled. Seraphine, he said, very quietly, still looking out through the gap in the curtain. Is there another way out of this house? Her blood went cold. Yes, she said. Show me. Part 4. Seraphine moved fast. She didn't stop to think about it. Didn't stop to weigh it or talk herself through the logic, because there wasn't time for logic anymore. She crossed the parlor, pushed through the narrow door beside the bookcase that most people who visited this house didn't know existed, and led him into the back corridor that ran along the spine of the building like a hidden thought. Caelum followed without a word. That was one thing she was already learning about him. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. When something needed doing, he simply did it, and he matched her pace without being told to, and he moved through her house in the dark, like a man who had spent a significant portion of his life moving through dark places, quiet, deliberate, aware of every sound. She brought him to the kitchen, past the cold stove, to the low door at the back that opened onto the old herb garden her mother had planted and never finished. The garden was just a white rectangle of snow now, bordered by the stone wall on 3 sides and the woodshed on the 4th. Beyond the woodshed was the backfield. Beyond the field was the forest that ran northeast for 2 miles before it thinned out near the Aldenmere road. She stopped at the door and turned to look at him. If you go through the field and stay along the tree line, you'll hit the road in about 40 minutes on foot, she said. There's a village called Southwick, small, an inn called the Harrow. The woman who runs it, her name is Dottie Crane. Tell her Seraphine sent you. She'll give you a room, and she won't ask questions. He was looking at her with that particular expression she was coming to recognize, the one that meant he was taking in more than she was saying. You've used that route before, he said. That's not your concern right now. Seraphine, go, she said, before that rider decides to stop waiting and come to the door. He didn't move. She looked at him and felt the urgency pressing at the back of her throat, and also, underneath it, something she absolutely did not have time for right now, something warm and inconvenient and frighteningly specific to this man, to the way he was standing in her cold kitchen looking at her like leaving was the problem and not the solution. I'm not going to disappear, he said. I know. I'll come back. I know that too, she said it steadily. Now go, please. Before I have to explain to an armed stranger why there's a duke in my herb garden. Something moved through his expression, that almost smile, and then he reached out and did something she was absolutely not prepared for. He tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face. One touch, barely 2 seconds. Gentle in a way that felt completely at odds with everything else he was, and then he was gone, through the low door and into the white garden, and moving across the snow toward the woodshed with that quiet, deliberate pace that left her standing in her own kitchen, feeling like the floor had shifted 3 inches to the left. She stood there for one breath. Then she smoothed her expression flat, turned around, and walked to the front of the house to deal with the man at the road. He was closer than she'd expected. By the time she reached the front window, he had already come through the gate, which she had not heard open, which meant he had been moving while she was moving, and he was now standing at her front path, looking at the house with the particular stillness of a man who was deciding something. He was not from any county assessor's office. He was lean and gray-coated and had the kind of face that had never wasted time on warmth. A working face. A face that had been used for one specific purpose for so long it had forgotten how to look like anything else. He had one hand at his side and the other in his coat pocket, and she did not need to see what was in the coat pocket to understand what it was. Seraphine opened the front door. She did it unhurriedly. She stood in the doorway with her shawl and her composure and her 3 years of having to look at difficult men and not let them see anything useful, and she waited. The man looked at her. I'm looking for someone. Most people who come to a door are, she said. Who are you? That's not relevant. It is to me, she said. This is my property. I don't speak to men who won't give me their name. A pause. He was recalculating. She could see it. He had come here expecting a frightened woman, or a compliant one, or possibly no one at all, and she was being none of those things, and it was slowing him down. Renwick, he said. Short. Like it cost him something. Mr. Renwick. What is it you're looking for? A man. Tall. Dark hair. He would have come through this area last night during the storm. A great many people came through this area last night during the storm, she said. It was a significant storm. This one would have been injured. Or at least. He stopped. He was looking at her face, looking for the tell, and she gave him nothing. Appearing to be injured. Appearing to be. Interesting word choice. I didn't see anyone like that, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her into the house, and she resisted the absolute urge to shift or block his sight line, because people who had nothing to hide didn't block sight lines, and she had nothing to hide, and Caelum Ashford was not in this house. You live here alone, Renwick said. With my housekeeper. No other staff? No guests? No guests. Each word separate and clean. Mr. Renwick, I've been very cooperative with you, and you've shown me no authorization, and given me only one name, and it is Cold, and I have a great deal of work to do today. If you have a warrant or an official document of some kind, I am happy to look at it. Otherwise, as I'm going to ask you to leave my property. He looked at her for 5 full seconds. Then he said, If you see anyone matching that description, you'll want to report it immediately. He reached into his coat. Her whole body went quiet, and produced a small card, which he held out. She walked down the path and took it from him. A name, an address in London, nothing else. Have a good morning, she said. He left. She stood in the cold and watched him go all the way back through the gate and down the road until he was out of sight, and then she went inside and closed the door and leaned against it and let herself breathe. Mabel appeared from the hallway. Well, we need to talk, Seraphine said. About the Duke? Seraphine looked at her. You knew. Mabel had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I recognized the coat buttons, she said. The Wrenmore crest. I didn't want to alarm you. Mabel. Seraphine said her name the way you say someone's name when you need them to understand the full weight of the conversation that is about to happen. Sit down. They sat at the kitchen table where Seraphine had sat alone at 2 a.m. with her cold tea, and Seraphine put the card Renwick had given her on the table between them, and she told Mabel what Caelum had told her in the parlor with the curtains closed about her father, about the debt that wasn't really a debt, about the agreement Dorian Voss had signed 15 years ago, before Seraphine was old enough to understand what signing your name to something really meant, and what that agreement had set in motion, and why the estate had been struggling not because of her father's carelessness, but because someone had been making sure it struggled, making sure she was desperate enough to sell. Mabel sat very still when she was done. He told you all of this, Mabel said. Yes, why would he tell you that? Seraphine picked up the card, looked at it. That, she said quietly, is exactly the right question. Because it was. Because Caelum Ashford had come to her door in a blizzard, hidden his identity for hours, and then, At the first moment she'd pushed, told her something that handed her power over her own situation. Men with power didn't do that. Men with power held information, used it. They didn't lay it on the table of a woman who had no particular reason to trust them and say, "Here, this is what's been done to you." Unless they needed something from her, or unless they were not entirely what she'd decided they were. She didn't know which one it was. She wasn't sure which answer frightened her more. Outside, somewhere in the direction of the Aldenmere Road, a single crow lifted off a bare branch and disappeared into the white sky, and Seraphine Voss sat in her kitchen and understood, with the kind of cold clarity that comes when the last comfortable illusion falls away, that she was no longer on the outside of whatever this was. She was in it. She had been in it possibly for 15 years. She just hadn't known it yet. Part 5. Seraphine didn't wait for Caelum to come back. She went to find him. It wasn't a reckless decision, or at least that was what she told herself while she pulled on her heaviest coat and her boots, and told Mabel to lock the doors and not open them for anyone, not for a county man, not for a friendly face, not for God himself unless he had documentation. Mabel looked at her the way she always looked at her when she was about to do something that couldn't be undone, that particular expression of resigned recognition, and then she bolted the door behind her. The snow was hard and bright under the morning sun. Every step crunched. The cold hit her face like something with an opinion about her being out in it, and she walked fast. Following the line of tracks Caelum had left across the backfield, the long even strides of a man who knew how to move through open ground without wasting effort. She had gone over it 3 times in her kitchen, and it came out the same way every time. He had told her the truth, not a version of it, not a useful portion of it. The whole thing, including the parts that implicated people with more power than either of them, including the parts that explained her father in ways that were painful and complicated, and didn't resolve into anything clean. He had told her, and then he had left before she could ask him why he'd told her, which was either because he trusted her with it, or because he needed her to have it, for reasons she hadn't figured out yet. She needed to know which one. She found him at the edge of the forest. He hadn't gone to Southwick. He was standing at the tree line where the field ended, just standing there in the cold with his back to her, and he turned when he heard her coming because of course he did, because Caelum Ashford apparently didn't miss anything. He looked at her crossing the field toward him, and something moved through his face that she couldn't name. "I told you to go to the inn," he said when she reached him. "I know, Seraphine." "There was a man," she said, "at my door. After you left. His name is Renwick. He was looking for you, and he had a weapon, and he looked like a man who had used it before and intended to use it again." She watched his face. "You know who he is?" It wasn't a question. His jaw tightened slightly, and that small movement told her more than most men's full confessions would have. "He works for Aldrich Wrenmore," Caelum said. The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Aldrich Wrenmore, her neighbor. The man who had been offering to buy her East Field for 2 years with that patient, sympathetic smile that she had always found slightly wrong without being able to say exactly why. The man who had come to her father's funeral and held her hand and said, with what had seemed like genuine feeling, that Dorian Voss had been a complicated man but a good one. She had believed him. She had been grateful for it. "He's the one," she said. "Not a question either. He's one of them," Caelum said. "He's not the top of it. But he's close enough to the top that removing him would make the whole structure unstable." He paused. "That's what I came here to do. Not to your door specifically. I was trying to reach someone in this county who could testify to the agreement your father signed, someone who had seen the original document, and I was intercepted on the road. Your gate was the nearest shelter." She absorbed this. "Who were you trying to reach?" "A solicitor named Garveth. He had a copy." Had. Caelum looked at her steadily. "He died 2 weeks ago. It was made to look like natural causes." The cold seemed to get colder. She stood in it and let the information settle, and thought about the man who had come to her door, claiming to be from the county assessor's office, 2 weeks ago while she was out. 2 weeks ago, right around the time a solicitor named Garveth apparently died of natural causes. She thought about the card Renwick had given her, the London address, and she thought about Aldrich Wrenmore's patient smile, and she thought about the East Field. "He doesn't just want the East Field," she said slowly. "He wants all of it," Caelum said. "Your entire estate. The land borders a parcel that, combined with his own holdings, would give him enough consolidated acreage to petition the crown for a title. Elevation. He's been working toward it for 20 years. Your father's agreement was supposed to be the mechanism. When your father died before it could be executed, Wrenmore started making the estate difficult to sustain instead. Quietly, through debt instruments and assessment interference and—" He stopped. He was watching her face. "I'm sorry," he said, and the simplicity of it, the directness, hit her somewhere undefended. "About your father, what I told you earlier, it doesn't make him a bad man. It makes him a man who was trapped and didn't know how to tell his daughter." She looked away at the trees. The forest was dark between the trunks and perfectly still, and she stared into it and felt the grief and the anger move through her in one long, complicated wave. Grief for a father she had spent 3 years resenting, and was only now beginning to understand. Anger at the man who had made sure she would struggle and smile while he did it. "What do you need from me?" she said. Her voice came out steady. She was glad of that. "There's a second copy of the document," Caelum said. "Your father kept one. I believe it's in this estate. Fenmore believes it too. That's why Renwick was here. Not just for me. For the document." She turned back to look at him. "Where in the estate?" "I don't know. But you might. If you think about where your father kept the things he didn't want found." She thought about her father, about his distracted half-presence and his quiet voice and the way he used to sit in that chair by the fire with his hands folded like a man carrying something heavy. She thought about the locked drawer in his study that she had never been able to open because she'd never been able to find the key, the one she'd eventually stopped thinking about because the estate had needed too much of her attention to spend it picking old locks. She knew where the document was. She knew it the way you know something you've known for a long time without letting yourself know it. "Come with me," she said. They went back across the field together and in through the kitchen door, and Seraphine went straight to her father's study with Caelum. Behind her and crossed to the fireplace and felt along the top of the mantel on the left side, the side her father always rested his left hand on when he stood there, and her fingers found the small brass key taped to the underside of the stone lip. She looked at it in her palm for a moment. Then she went to the desk. The locked drawer opened on the first try. Inside was a bundle of papers tied with a green ribbon, and a smaller envelope beneath it, and on the envelope in her father's handwriting were 2 words. Her name. She stood very still. Caelum stood behind her and said nothing, which she was grateful for because she needed a moment, just one moment, with the fact that her father had known she would be the one to find this, had known and had left her name on it like an apology he hadn't known how to deliver any other way. She took the papers. She left the envelope where it was and closed the drawer. "Is this enough?" she asked, to stop him. With the right person presenting it, yes. He took the bundle from her carefully. "I have people in London. It will take me 2 days to get this to them safely. But Seraphine." He said her name the way he'd said it in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and she looked up at him. "Fenmore will know by tonight that Renwick didn't find what he came for. He'll come himself, and he'll be less careful about how he does it. He'll come to my door. Yes. While you're in London, yes." She thought about that. She thought about Aldrich Fenmore and his patient smile and his 2 years of sympathetic offers, and she thought about Renwick and his gray coat and his coat pocket, and she thought about being alone in this house with Mabel and a locked door and 3 years of surviving things that should have finished her. "I know how to handle Aldrich Fenmore," she said. Something shifted in Caelum's face. Something she hadn't seen there before. Something unguarded and uncontained. And before she could step back from it, or name it, or decide what to do with it, he crossed the distance between them and put his hand against her face, her jaw gently the way you touch something you are not entirely sure you are allowed to touch. "I'll be back in 2 days," he said quietly. "I know." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't do anything that can't be undone before I'm back. I can't promise that. I know that too." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Never quite a smile. That's what worries me. He left through the back the same way he had come, and she stood in her father's study with the smell of old paper and cold ash, and the morning light coming in at a low angle, and she thought about the envelope in the drawer, with her name on it, and she thought about a man with dark eyes and bare feet in her kitchen, and she thought about Aldrich Fenmore, who was going to come to her door tonight with that patient smile, and absolutely no idea what she knew. She was ready. She had been surviving for 3 years. She was very tired of just surviving. Part 6, Aldrich Fenmore came at dusk. Seraphine had been expecting him since noon, which meant she had spent the better part of the day preparing, and preparation was the one thing in her life she had never done badly. She had sent Mabel to her sister's house in the village with strict instructions and a small bag and the kind of look that communicated, without words, that this was not a request. Mabel had gone, reluctantly, with her coat half-buttoned and her mouth pressed into a line of profound disapproval. Then Seraphine had lit every lamp in the front of the house and sat down in her father's chair and waited. The knock, when it came, was pleasant, almost neighborly. 3 measured taps, the kind a man makes when he wants you to think he has all the time in the world. She opened the door. Aldrich Fenmore was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had the broad, comfortable face of a man who had never in his life been told no by anyone who mattered to him. He was dressed well. He was always dressed well. He stood on her step with a lantern and a sympathetic expression that she had once found reassuring and now read like a language she wished she hadn't learned. "Seraphine," he said warmly, "I heard you had some trouble this morning. A strange man on your road. I wanted to come and make sure you were well." "That's very kind of you, Aldrich," she said. "Come in," she said it calmly. She stepped back and led him into her hallway and watched him take in the lit lamps and the empty house, watched him register that there was no Mabel, no staff, no buffer, and watched him decide that this was an advantage for him rather than a warning. That was his first mistake. She brought him to the parlor and sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap and let him talk. He was good at talking. He asked about her welfare. He mentioned the difficult winter. He circled toward the subject of the estate with that practiced patience of his, the same patience he'd been applying to her for 2 years, and she let him circle. Then she put the card on the table between them. Renwick's card, the one with the London address. Fenmore looked at it. Something moved behind his eyes, quick and cold, like something swimming beneath ice. "He came to my door this morning," she said. "He was looking for someone. I found it troubling, so I looked into it." She let that sit. "A man with no official authorization, no documentation, a weapon in his coat pocket, coming from you. Seraphine, I don't know what. Aldrich." She said his name the way she'd learned to say difficult things, quietly, without heat. "I know about the agreement. I know about the debt instruments. I know about the assessment interference. And I know about the solicitor in London, whose death was very conveniently timed." She watched his face do the thing faces did when the ground moved under them unexpectedly. "I know all of it." The warmth left his expression like a lamp being turned down. What replaced it was not rage. That almost would have been easier. What replaced it was a kind of calculation, cold and unhurried, that reminded her of what Caelum had said. "He's close enough to the top that removing him would make the whole structure unstable." She was looking at the top of something right now. She understood that. A man who had spent 20 years building towards something didn't dismantle easily. "You're a clever woman," he said. His voice had changed. Still pleasant, but the warmth was performance now, and he'd stopped performing. "You've always been clever. Your father said that about you. He was proud of it." Pause. "He was also afraid of it, toward the end." She kept her face still. "Is that meant to unsettle me?" "It's meant to help you understand," he said. "That clever doesn't always translate to safe. You're alone in this house. You have no husband, no male relative, no one with any legal standing to represent your interests. What you have is land and a document that you think protects you." He leaned forward slightly. "I've been doing this for 20 years, Seraphine. Whatever you found in that desk, whatever someone told you about it, you are one woman against a structure that has survived much larger obstacles than you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The document is already in London." The silence that followed was the most satisfying silence of her entire life. She watched him absorb it, watched the calculation run and come up short, watched the 20 years of patient building flicker behind his eyes like a flame in a draft. "It left this morning," she said. "By now it's in the hands of someone who knows exactly what to do with it, and who has been looking for a reason to do it for longer than you'd find comfortable." She stood up. "You should leave now, Aldrich. I think we're done here." He stood slowly. He was still controlled, still composed, but the composure's was working harder than it had been, and they both knew it. He picked up Renwick's card from the table and put it in his pocket and looked at her with an expression that had finally, completely, dropped all pretense. "This isn't finished," he said. "No," she agreed, "but your part in it is." She showed him to the door and closed it behind him and listened to his footsteps on the path, and then the sound of his carriage, and then nothing, just the house and the dark and the lamps burning in every room. She went back to her father's study. She sat in his chair for a while without doing anything. Just sat in it the way she'd watched him sit in the chair in the parlor, hands folded, carrying something. She understood now what he had been carrying, and it didn't make her less sad, but it made the sadness a different shape, softer around the edges, less like anger wearing grief as a coat. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. Her father's handwriting was cramped and slanting, the handwriting of a man who thought faster than his hand could follow. She read slowly. She read it twice. By the time she finished the second reading, her eyes were wet, and she let them be wet because there was no one here to see it, and she was very tired of being composed for people. He had known. He had known what Fenmore was, had known what the agreement meant, had spent years trying to find a way out of it that didn't take everything down with it. He had not told her because he was ashamed, and because he thought he still had time, and because he had, in the particular way of men who love their daughters quietly and imperfectly, believed she would be all right without knowing, that she was strong enough that the not knowing was a mercy. He had been wrong about the mercy part. He had not been wrong about the strength. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket, close to her, and sat in the quiet house with her lamps burning and thought about 3 years of fighting alone, and about a key taped to the underside of a mantle, and about the shape of a debt that had never really been about money. Caelum came back on the second day, not at dusk, not dramatically, just in the mid-morning, through the back gate, with mud on his boots and his collar turned up against the cold, looking like a man who had not slept in 40 hours, but had completed what he set out to do. She heard the garden gate, and came to the kitchen door, and they stood there for a moment, him in the cold, and her in the doorway, and the morning was very still. "It's done," he said. "I know. I had a message from a Mr. Holt in London yesterday evening." She paused. "He said to tell you the structure is, in his words, considerably less stable than it was." Something moved through Caelum's face. Relief, she thought, though on him it was quiet and inward. The relief of a man who had been holding something tightly for a very long time and had finally been able to set it down. "Fenmore?" he asked. "Came the night you left. We had a conversation." She held his gaze. "He won't be making any more offers on my East Field." He looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do?" "I was practical," she said. The almost smile came. She was starting to love that almost smile, the way it came and went, the way it meant something had genuinely reached him. She opened the kitchen door wider. "Come inside. You look terrible." "Thank you," he said completely sincerely, and she laughed, an actual laugh, which surprised her almost as much as it surprised him. And she saw what it did to his face when she laughed, the way he went very still for just a second, like a man encountering something he hadn't prepared for, and she turned away so she didn't have to decide what to do with that yet. She made tea. He sat at her kitchen table, her father's table, and she put a cup in front of him, and sat across from him, and the morning came in through the windows, and the house felt different than it had in 3 years. Not lighter, exactly, more inhabited, more like a place where things happened rather than a place where one person worked quietly, against the current. "You're going back to London," she said. It wasn't a question. Not immediately. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "There are proceedings now, investigations. I'll need to be present for some of them, but not yet." He looked at her across the table. "The estate will need some things sorted, legally. The debt instruments Fenmore used were not entirely legitimate, but they're not entirely nothing, and there are men in London who can address that. With the document and the right representation, you'll come out of this free and clear." A pause. "It should have been that way 15 years ago." "A lot of things should have been different 15 years ago," she said. "Yes." She thought about her father's letter in her coat pocket. She thought about her mother leaving on a cold morning. She thought about 3 years of being survivable, and how that word had never once felt like enough, only like the minimum, the absolute bare floor of a life, and how something had shifted in the last 2 days that she didn't quite have the language for yet. Something that had to do with knowing the full truth of a thing, even when the truth was hard, and still being standing at the end of it. "I read his letter," she said. Caelum was quiet. "He was trying to protect me," she said. "He was wrong about how to do it, but that's what he was trying to do." She looked down at her tea. "I've been angry at him for 3 years for being careless. He wasn't careless. He was trapped and ashamed, and he loved me badly, the way people love when they don't know how to ask for help." She paused. "I understand that better than I'd like to." She felt him looking at her. She looked up. "You're not alone in this anymore," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I want you to know that." She held his gaze. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the snow was starting to melt at the edges. The first slow concession to the end of winter, and the light on the table between them was soft and level, and she thought about iron gates and blizzards and a man on his knees who was never really on his knees, and she thought about all the ways things arrived in your life disguised as emergencies. "I know," she said. She meant it. He stayed 3 more days before Lund called him back. They were quiet days, practical days. He helped her sort through the papers in her father's study with a methodical attention to detail that she recognized as a form of care. They ate at the kitchen table. They talked in the evenings by the fire, real conversations, the kind that moved around freely without either of them managing the other, and she learned pieces of him slowly, the same way she learned everything, carefully and without rushing. He left on a Tuesday morning. She walked him to the gate. 2 weeks, he said. 3 at the most. You said that last time, she said. You were back in 2 days. The circumstances were different last time. They were, she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The gate was between them, iron and familiar, and she thought about the first time she had stood here with her candle and her doubt, and her hand on the latch. He reached through the bars and took her hand briefly, and she let him, and then he went, and she stood at her gate in the morning light, and watched him down the road, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not hope exactly. Something more grounded than hope. Something that had been earned. But it was the first time in 3 years that alone felt like a beginning. The story of Seraphine and Caelum is not over. There is more coming, more truth to uncover, more ground to stand on together. If this story has meant something to you, subscribe and hit the bell, because the next chapter is already on its way. Don't let it find you unprepared. She turned back toward the house. There was work to do, the way there was always work to do, but the work felt different now. It felt like building rather than holding, like forward rather than just not back. The gate closed behind her with its familiar groan. She walked through her own front door and into her own house, and she was alone in it again.